Here is Republican Congressman Justin Amash responding to House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy's attacks on him after Congressman Amash announced his support for impeachment of President Trump.
You saw what happened to me from our so-called leader, Kevin McCarthy. I read the Mueller report. I'm sure he did not read it. I stated what it actually says, and he just resorted to ad hominem attacks and other various attacks that have nothing to do with the Mueller report. This is the kind of leadership, in quotes, that we now have in Congress.
Joining our discussion now is Tom Coleman, a former Republican congressman from Missouri who supports the impeachment of President Trump. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And I want to get your reaction to what Congressman Amash has done. And do you expect he will be joined eventually or at any point by any other Republicans in the House?
Well, it is a brave move that he is making. And you hope that if you were in that position that you'd be able to rise to the occasion as well. And I think that you got to start somewhere. I don't have a whole lot of hope for the Republicans in the House. I do hope eventually, if there are impeachment proceedings that go forward in the House Judiciary Committee and pass the House, that the Senate and the Republican senators over there who have the actual authority and responsibility to convict the president and remove him from office, that's where the real key decisions will be made and where I think we need to see some profiles and courage.
You make a point that I haven't heard anyone else make. You believe that the Mueller report shows that the Trump presidency is an illegitimate presidency, which also means that the vice presidency of Mike Pence is illegitimate in your reading of it because the Russians interfered to help Donald Trump win the presidency, and it worked. And that's your basic case about the illegitimacy of it. And so you argue the point that if it ever got to the point where Donald Trump was removed through the impeachment process, it would be wrong to install Mike Pence as the president because of that illegitimacy you identify.
That's right. They run as a ticket, obviously, and the Russians want. I mean, Putin himself said in Helsinki that he wanted Trump to win, so he also wanted Pence to win as well because they came, very tight. You couldn't separate them. So we have an illegitimate president and illegitimate vice president. If we remove the presidency and end up with Pence, we still have an illegitimate president. That's unacceptable. So I would call on, at that point, Mr. Pence to resign or have him impeached like the president. If for no other reason, he's been like the #1 enabler of this dangerous president that we've seen in the last 3 years.
Congressman Coleman, at Justin Amash's town hall, there were a few different kinds of Republicans, including one who accused him of being a Democrat and having drunk the Kool-Aid. And he's trying to insist that, no, I'm as conservative as I've ever been on all policy issues. This isn't about partisanship. Other Republicans stood up and said, I'm a Republican, but I see your point, and I'm on principle in favor of going ahead with impeachment, even if the Senate wouldn't act to remove the president. What is your sense of Republicans out there and what the range of opinion is? How much Republican support or at least agreement, acquiescence might there be if the House Democrats were to impeach?
Well, I think if the House Democrats were to impeach, they would have to go through the entire hearing process, television coverage, gavel to gavel. Just like Watergate, we both lived through that, Lawrence, and we know that public opinion can change. The polls are not that far apart right now, but it's something as serious as this. You cannot blindly follow polls. What you need to do is follow the evidence, and if you're a member of Congress, your conscience. I think once the public is informed and understands what all went on, just like that lady you had on up there in Amash's district, she didn't know anything that was wrong, that the president did wrong. That's got to come out. Now, Robert Mueller today said that he was not going to testify before the Judiciary Committee. I think that's wrong in this sense. I believe he owes it to the nation and to future generations to go up there and tell the story that he wrote up. It's not going to be the circus that he anticipates. If the Republicans get out of hand, they will be looked at as that, out of hand. And I think that he would provide the credibility to the report that, as we all know, a lot of people are not reading.
And the other point that is made by that woman who was at Justin Amash's town hall, she's interested in government and politics enough to go to a town hall. She had no idea there was anything negative in the report. I mean, I don't know how Robert Mueller can think tonight that the report speaks for itself if people aren't reading it.
Exactly. And, you know, I think he could probably read the New York telephone book and get a lot of people looking at him. Yeah. Today he spent 9 minutes, and I mean, it's covered, it's wall-to-wall coverage. That's what he can command. That's the integrity, and that's what we need.
Former Republican Congressman Tom Coleman gets tonight's last word. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.